30 unpopular Nintendo opinions. That's pretty much self-explanatory. I will just quickly say though that, well, maybe avoid this video if you consider yourself a Nintendo fan. The Switch has been an underwhelming follow-up to the Wii U and 3DS. I've gone in detail about this in 2 previous videos of mine, but I'll touch on this here of course. I do feel like times have improved, especially this current year. Nintendo have probably been at their best since at least 2017, but it doesn't really change the fact that the first 4 or so years of the Switch were pretty mediocre. I feel like a good majority of games on the Switch for a majority of its lifespan have felt like they faced a lack of innovation. They failed to provide a brand new experience that I haven't already taken away from their older games. As a whole, the Switch does have more on offer than the Wii U did have, but the Wii U, combined with the 3DS especially, did have a much more dense output of good games. And this, among a lot of other elements, has led this console to become very disappointing for me. And I would have assumed many other Wii U owners as well, but evidently not given what video this is in. The Wii U was extremely underappreciated at the time, not in retrospect. Specifically as an 8th gen console, it easily outdid the Xbox One and PS4 during 2013, 2014 and even partially 2015 in terms of the output of high quality games. There were so many great Nintendo games that released during that time that I find it crazy that so many people were adamant about how there was nothing to play on the Wii U. Looking at 2014 in particular, we had games like Bayonetta, Mario Kart, Donkey Kong, Smash Bros, and of the few notable releases on other platforms, well, none of them were particularly compelling to me. The 8th gen didn't really start to pick up until 2015 or 16 onwards, and by that point the Wii U was essentially dead anyway, so within the peak of the Wii U's lifespan and support, it was easily the best choice of the 3 home consoles. The SNES is Nintendo's most overrated console. Don't get me wrong, it's a great console, for its time. There's definitely many great games on it, games that do hold up to today's standard. The third-party lineup in general is fantastic, but overall I do find the SNES to have one of the weakest first-party libraries from Nintendo, to the point where I'd say the N64, GameCube, Wii, Wii U, and Switch all have far superior first-party libraries. I can only really point to about 3 of the games on the platform that I think are genuinely great, being Super Metroid and the first 2 Donkey Kong Country games. Everything else on offer here are either mediocre or at best decent. The N64 gets a lot of flack, especially comparative to the SNES, but even then I feel like I'd rather play just Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask over the entirety of Nintendo's SNES games combined. Super Mario Odyssey is a poor direction for the series. It's not my least favourite Mario game, but it's definitely not one of my favourites. The gameplay and controls are absolutely stunning. It's the best the series has to offer, but the game's design does not prop them up at all. The game has a serious lack of any challenge, the design has very little focus, and the game essentially transformed the series into a collectathon. I don't think Odyssey is a well-designed game, in the sense that the moons aren't as well crafted or polished the same way that Stars and Shines are in 64 and Sunshine, and the platforming is nowhere near as polished, challenging, or engaging as the Galaxy games and 3D World, leading to a game that's the worst of both gameplay styles. Sunshine is easily one of the best Mario games, the second best to be specific. I don't know if this is necessarily an unpopular opinion, but Sunshine does come off as the black sheep of the franchise, so I'm including it here anyway. It has the best structure of any 3D Mario game. If you smoosh together 64 and Sunshine, it would be the perfect Mario game for me. I hate that Nintendo never fully followed through with Sunshine's design, and by the time they returned to the quote-unquote sandbox design with Odyssey, they butchered it. Super Paper Mario is one of the worst Mario games I have ever played. Actually, I'll one-up that, one of the worst Nintendo games, full stop. This game is plagued with awful level design, abysmal stiff and unpolished gameplay controls and especially combat, not to mention the terrible art direction and character design. The only thing I like about this game is its story and some novel concepts, but even then it's very inconsistent in pacing anyway. I would much rather play Sticker Star over this game. On the other hand, Paper Mario the Origami King is easily the best Paper Mario game. In fact, I think the Origami King is by far the best Nintendo Switch game, and one of Nintendo's best games of all time. It would easily fall within my top 5 Mario games. It scratched an itch I had for a Nintendo game, a Mario and or Zelda style game that both Odyssey and Breath of the Wild were unable to scratch. It has extremely creative ideas, very fun writing and lovable characters, a great story in general, There's fun puzzle-based combat, especially the boss fights, which are amazing and the best the series has to offer. And beyond everything else, it has unrivaled presentation with very pretty environments and one of the best Mario soundtracks to date. I think it's a massive shame that people hate this game so much, because if it weren't connected to the Paper Mario series, I think people would love it. Mario Kart 8 is a really bland Mario Kart game. Kinda. I didn't care for 8 at launch for a myriad of reasons. I have come to appreciate it a lot more in recent years, and it has improved heavily too, due to the support it's had over time through DLC and its re-release, such as 200cc, new characters, modes, mechanics, etc. But I don't think the game is good enough to carry the entire Wii U and Switch's lifespan with no alternative Mario Kart or racing games at all. I'm starved for the genre from Nintendo, and half-assed DLC to a 10-year-old game isn't gonna satiate that. I really wish that Star Fox racing game wasn't an elaborate lie. Breath of the Wild is the worst 3D Zelda game. It's a good game, sure. Is it a good Zelda game? Well, that's become contentious these days, but I will just say that I am personally a massive Zelda fan. It's my favorite game series of all time, and Breath of the Wild manages to squander everything I love about it. The reasons I even like Zelda to begin with are more or less completely absent here. It does its exploration great, of course, but pretty much absolutely everything else outside of it is mediocre at best, leading to a game I feel very lukewarm about. Tears of the Kingdom is a pretty poor sequel. It's better than Breath of the Wild, sure, and there is a lot of this game that I really respect and appreciate, but I am genuinely shocked to how this game has received just as much acclaim, if not more, than Breath of the Wild, considering that it pretty much took its structure and design one-to-one and copy-pasted it here. Not to mention the identical overworld, of course. The game barely addressed any issues that Breath of the Wild suffered from, the story is extremely rough, and the game just doesn't do enough new to really justify the long development cycle and recycling of the overworld and identical structure, in my opinion. This new Zelda formula within just 2 games has already become far more stale than the previous one had ever become. Minish Cap is a bad Zelda game. While this isn't close to being the most popular Zelda game, it sure does receive a lot of praise, which I don't understand. The map is too small, the dungeons are too simple, the Minish Cap gimmick is neat conceptually but is barely used and should have been heavily expanded upon, and removing that, the game feels very uninspired and basic. Beyond everything else, I really hate the RNG mechanics. In fact, I'm not a huge fan of the Capcom Zelda games in general, but we'll leave it at just Minish Cap for this video. Wind Waker is extremely overrated. Don't get me wrong, I do like this game, quite a bit even, but man, it's easily up there with being one of the most overrated games of all time, in my opinion. It's the worst traditional 3D Zelda, it has cut corners and the pacing feels very off, the dungeons aren't very good and there's a lack of them to begin with, while there's a lack of content in this game in general. The open sea of the game acts to just pad it out with tedious sailing that even the swift sail barely mitigates. The art style isn't exactly my cup of tea, and not the direction I wish this series went in after Majora's Mask. Twilight Princess is a far superior game to this, but is routinely shat on, while people praise this game to high heaven, and I do not understand why. Skyward Sword is an extremely good and underrated video game. The sky is underwhelming, sure, and maybe they could have dialed a little back on the repetition and backtracking, but the dense and detailed level design of the surface is immensely fun to traverse, explore, and make your way through. It's much better than the vast, barren world of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The dungeons here are very creative and some of my all-time favorites from the series. The watercolor graphics and art direction is very appealing. The combat is easily the best the series has to offer with its directional sword fighting, and it of course has by far the best Zelda story and characters too. I hate that every time this game is brought up in discussions, without fail, you'll see people shit on it because I really feel like it gives a wrong impression of this game. There is so much here to love. Ultimate is the most underwhelming and boring Smash sequel. It is technically the best of the series, but to what end? I don't really care for this game, at least to the same extent that I did for Brawl and 4. It brought barely anything new to the table and felt like a retreading of Smash 4, compared to every previous game in the franchise that felt like massive evolutions from their counterparts and offered ample new ideas and content. Actually, I've gotten to a point where I'd rather the Smash series go fully first party and not include third party reps at all. With the exception of Metal Gear that can stay. Outside of really obscure one-off games like Nintendo Land and Captain Rainbow, if you really want to count that, Smash Bros. Was the only game series that celebrated all of Nintendo's franchises in the form of a crossover. Smash Ultimate kinda moved away from Nintendo and prioritized a mishmash of whatever third parties, which strays away from a big reason I even loved the series in the first place. I really hope the next game is more Nintendo-centric. I'd love Sakurai to step away from Smash entirely. I'm not saying I don't want any more Smash games, but it's very depressing to think that Sakurai has dedicated the last decade of his life to Smash Bros. And Smash Bros. DLC. I really do think he's a very talented developer, which makes it even worse to think of all the lost potential directed to this one creatively limited multiplayer-focused game franchise. I hope to see at least 1 or 2 more single-player projects from him in the future, and it would actually be devastating to have Smash 6 be announced with him at the helm anytime soon. Legends Arceus is a really bad video game. I feel like I've been in La La Land or something this past year or so considering all the praise this game receives, because this is honestly one of the worst games I've played through in recent memory. Even ignoring the PS1.5 looking visuals, terrible story and everything else people complain about this game, the gameplay here is extremely clunky, extremely repetitive and painfully boring. The main draw of the Pokemon series, for me at least, the battles, are more or less completely absent here. There are definitely some great concepts here and there scattered throughout, and I do like the whole Pokédex completion element in general, but I feel like even its best elements needed a whole lot more time to cook. On the other hand, Scarlet and Violet are seriously some of the best Pokemon games to release in a long time. It takes what worked with Legends Arceus and heavily improved on it, which makes that game retroactively feel like a beta for this one. The strongest element is having a fully open world and structure, in theory at least. Even with its caveats, this game still feels so refreshing after wave and wave of samey and uninspired games. There are issues, of course, but while I'm not trying to defend it, I can look past poor performance and a lack of polish if the game itself is actually good. Wii Sports was never that good. I do like Wii Sports Resort a lot, but the original Wii Sports, for some reason I can't comprehend, has some weird cult following and legacy. Which is what, a collection of 5 extremely mindless and simple minigames? I wish Kirby games were more difficult. The atmosphere, music and style of these games are great. They're fun to maybe just turn your brain off and enjoy them for what they are. That said, the difficulty, or lack thereof, in these games prevent me from really finding myself becoming engaged or stimulated by the gameplay. And I think it's a shame because there is a lot of potential in this series. Notably, the true arena modes highlight how brilliant the gameplay and combat in these games are, or at least could be, if the rest of the game wasn't easy baby mode, and I really wish that wasn't the case. I absolutely love the 2D Metroid games, but I cannot stand Metroid Prime. I don't really understand why so many people say that Metroid Prime is a perfect adaptation of Super Metroid into a 3D environment, because it absolutely isn't. This game has a poorly interconnected overworld design and a pretty linear intended route that leads to aggressively egregious backtracking. It has extremely slow-paced exploration gameplay with puzzles, scanning, and poor combat. The 2D games are high-octane, fast-paced action platformers, whereas the Prime series are slow-paced, puzzle-based FPSs. They are far from comparable. Honestly, not do I just think that, and I'm gonna be killed for saying this, Other M is a better game than Prime. It is a far better direction to take the Metroid series in 3D. Xenoblade has awful combat and gameplay. These games feel like single-player MMOs, which is not a compliment. The passive combat present in these games are not very fun, and I never really feel like I'm in full control of it. And of course, combining it with the 30 billion systems that all interact with each other, this battle system is somehow simultaneously overly complex, while being mind-numbingly boring, and it's why I have never been able to play this series beyond finishing its first game. Star Fox Zero isn't that bad. The controls can get a little clunky, sure, but there's some really fun set pieces and locales here. The visuals are great, and some of the bosses are pretty fun. I don't think it's the best Star Fox game, but it is nowhere near as bad as people make it out to be, and it's easily the best Star Fox game that's released in the past 15 to 20 years. Don't read into that too much. Fire Emblem Three Houses is not good. I'd maybe say it's my least favourite Fire Emblem game I've played through. The monastery and social elements really drag this game down. It's a complete polar opposite to fun, and the fact that the game focuses on it so much in favour of the other more important elements is terrible. The map design here is some of the worst in the series. There's barely any strategy involved, especially considering the removal of the weapon triangle, which results in this game being brain dead easy, on hard mode at least. The visuals look appalling, which isn't surprising considering it was originally going to be a 3DS game. And to actually understand the full story, you have to go through the first half of the game, which is easily the worst part of it, at least 3 times, which is roughly 15 to 20 hours each time. This game is an utter mess. Now, Engage, on the other hand, is amazing, and some of the most fun I've had with Fire Emblem in years, so at least I can say that Three Houses didn't permanently ruin the series for good. Splatoon 3 was a completely unnecessary sequel. In fact, I find this game absolutely insulting. A fully priced game 5 years after the second, only to release with less content that game had, and with worse online connectivity issues, which is still a thing to this day, by the way. The only real things of note this game brings to the table are more or less minor quality of life improvements and its single player campaign. The single player isn't bad, it's not as good as Octo Expansion, but it's an improvement over 1 and 2 stories, but I still fail to understand why 7 years after the first game, this series hasn't evolved beyond the same basic formula. I found the initial trailer to be misleading because I really expected something different this time around, but maybe I'm delusional. Either way, Splatoon 3 really should have been DLC for Splatoon 2. Pikmin 4 is the weakest mainline Pikmin game. It's far from a bad game, of course. I absolutely adore the Pikmin series. I can't even say I was necessarily disappointed with this game either. But that said, it suffers from far too many issues which really destroyed my experience with it. The challenge and difficulty have been completely stripped away from it, and well, I know that Pikmin 3 wasn't particularly difficult either, but this one just takes it too far for me. Ochi, the slew of items the game throws at you, the basic design, nerfed enemies, and especially the borderline complete removal of any required strategy or management needed for the Pikmin themselves, all makes this game mind-numbingly easy compared to 1 and 2 as well as 3's side content. The controls are absolutely abysmal, mostly for the fact that you cannot aim, as well as the automatic lock-on. The story is a complete mess that contradicts every previous game in the series, and even if it didn't, the game's opening is a complete slog due to all the tutorials and boring dialogue. And while the graphics are probably better than Pikmin 3, I can't say the environments make the most out of them because they feel very bland and lack any variety, besides the massive house, I guess. Pikmin 3 has much more interesting and appealing levels for me. I'm realizing this opinion isn't strictly Nintendo, and even within the Nintendo fandom it's not really unpopular, but whatever. Gyro is the best innovation to come to controller design in years and shouldn't be dismissed by so many people. It is a far better way to aim than using an analog stick, and in fact ever since using Gyro I cannot go back to aiming with an analog stick. It feels absolutely awful, there's no precision at all. I'm gonna go one step further and also piss off PC gamers, but I also think the controller and gyro combination is better for shooters than keyboard and mouses. The 3D on the 3DS is amazing. The 3DS's low resolution and crusty visuals were always made up for by having the option of viewing the games in 3D. To this day, I play on my 3DS in fully 3D mode on everything I do just because of how pretty everything looks with it, and how gross they look without it. I knew far too many people that refused to ever use the thing. Actually, in general, there are far too many people that despise the feature outright and call it an awful gimmick, to the point where people actually praise games like Pokemon Sun and Moon for not including it. A missing feature that is an option that you're not forced to use. They had a whole model of 3DSs that couldn't even use 3D. This reminds me of gyro haters. But whatever, I should really stop psychoanalyzing gamers. The Wii U gamepad is good, actually. Not just is it far more ergonomic than the Switch, but it also has better analog sticks, face buttons, and a D-pad. People really hate this controller and to this day make fun of it, but why? I really miss the days of dual-screen Nintendo gaming, and the Wii U gamepad is no exception. Of course, there's plenty of games that were designed with it in mind and heavily utilize it, but even the standard games shine with it. Having interactive maps and menus on the go without having to pause a game, and more real estate for additional buttons is a godsend, and to this day I feel lost without it with the Switch. And finally, my most unpopular Nintendo opinion. It's unpopular because absolutely no one shares the same opinion as me because no one cares. Nintendo got the bumpers wrong with the Wii U onwards, or actually the Wii Classic Pro controller. The Z button should be bumpers and the L and R should be the main trigger buttons like the GameCube controller, like the Wii Classic controller, and like the 3DS. Treating the ZL and ZR buttons as the main buttons isn't inherently an issue, but Nintendo likes to prioritize L and R instead. It's especially bad in re-releases that try to map the controls one-to-one, requiring the terrible bumpers to be used instead of the triggers that your fingers are going to be naturally resting upon. I'm thinking NSO is most egregious for this. And that's it. If this video gets any views, these comments are probably going to be a train wreck, so that's fun to look forward to. Yeah, anyway, goodbye.